Man, oh man, I just got done watching part two of Peter Jackson's wonderful docuseries, The Beatles Get Back. Guys, whatever I'm going to say here won't do enough justice to part two of this three-part series. I am absolutely blown away. This 2 hours and a half and change, or however long it was, I think a little longer than that, was absolutely some of the best Beatles stuff I've ever seen in my entire life. I had gone on record as saying while part one at Twickenham Studios was interesting, and from a historic standpoint, and any Beatles fan would lap it up, said it was kind of dull at times. It wasn't really exciting. Boy, oh boy, is this different. Part two. I'm gonna read from my notes. Got a lot of notes here. This is fresh in my mind. I've only seen it once, but I will be watching it again probably tonight sometime. All right, we start out with part two, where we kind of left off after part one. And I should say there are spoilers here, spoilers galore. So, but nothing that's really going to ruin the movie anyway for you, I don't think. But anyway, we start off where we left off. We had George Harrison was disenchanted, was upset. He left and walked out, and now they left the whole production crew and the remaining three Beatles at a loss as to what to do from here. As we pick up part two, I like the fact that it starts out on January 13th, which is really a very fascinating day to me. Now, it's not a good day, it's not a positive day, but that gets better, okay? But we start out still in Twickenham Studios, and there's a very intimate discussion where everyone's sitting kind of like in the seats, kind of like in a circle. And we have, of course, Paul and Ringo, and we have Michael Lindsay Hogg, and we have Linda Eastman, Paul's girlfriend, and they're all sitting there and discussing what to do next. The discussion starts about the John and Yoko factor, about how, right now John is really into Yoko, and Paul says, if it's a choice between picking the Beatles and Yoko for John, it's going to be Yoko, and Paul tries to be pretty fair. He says, it's difficult with Yoko, but she's all right, she's great, but they just want to be together, Paul's been very careful, very, I don't know, PC about the situation, if you will, but I understand that. He says he thinks John's going overboard with the Yoko thing, but John always goes overboard, he says, and then, of course, there's the famous joke that's so great. He says, in 50 years' time, everybody's going to be saying that the Beatles broke up because Yoko sat on an amp. And that's just a funny bit. And that's kind of, everybody blames Yoko for the breakup, and Yoko was not the only factor. There's many factors, as the four Beatles always said, in the breakup. Now, Neil Aspinall is present also, and he says, there should be some kind of a compromise insofar as, I guess, the John and Yoko thing, and Paul responds, well, for them to compromise, Paul says, I need to be able to compromise, which will help them to compromise. I mean, Paul's really respectable here. I love how he's handling this. He really is going through a lot with this whole loss of his friend, really, because a lot of people know the wedding bells, so to speak, are breaking up that old gang of mine. So Paul really handles this well, but I got to tell you, there's a long, lingering shot of Paul's face. You can see his face and his eyes for a good period of time, and you can see even tears in his eyes. You can sense all the sadness that Paul's feeling, the disappointment, the frustration, the fear of an impending end of the Beatles. Now, I was one of the people at the beginning that said this project is, by Peter Jackson, is going to hope it doesn't whitewash the whole Beatles breakup thing. Let me tell you, there's enough so far in part one and part two to show you that the Beatles were coming apart at the seams. There's no getting around it. Sure, part two, they joined forces and get it together again for a while, like they used to. But there's lots of references in this to the fact that, maybe we should get a divorce, I think George says at one point in part one, and, maybe this is going to have to be the end, because nobody is working together. Nobody cares. Nobody's interested in anything that they're doing. This whole project of the TV show that's going to be abandoned, and then now a feature film. Nobody really cares except for Paul. But what's interesting is that at one point, Paul McCartney leaves the discussion because I think John Lennon is on the phone. When he leaves, Linda right away, like a free bird in a cage, has the permission to come alive. And she's like, she expresses, she says, she's a real fan of the Beatles. When Paul's gone, she's saying, I'm a fan, and, everyone wants to see the Beatles. And you see, it's almost like she's being restrained by Paul, and now that Paul's gone. At one point, Linda chimes in, and when Paul comes back, Paul returns, and Linda says something, and Paul looks at her and says, "You stay out of this, Yoko." Kidding around. Hey, you feminists out there, okay? If John is too accepting of Yoko and letting Yoko supposedly say too much and give a lot of opinions, Paul is certainly trying to keep Linda out of it, because you could just tell how she's able to come alive and express her opinion when Paul's gone. Now, where Paul finally goes is to have a lunchtime session. I should have mentioned that John is not at the discussion, the round table discussion. John is sleeping, so you only have Ringo and Paul there. George walked out, and John is home asleep. So finally, they ring John, and John arrives at lunchtime. But what's amazing, this is fascinating to me, John and Paul have a closed meeting, just the two of them, a private meeting in a cafeteria. We don't see any film footage of that, but what's incredible to me, both of them are unaware that a hidden microphone has been placed in a flower pot that's on the table. So the audio of their conversation, the private conversation between John and Paul, is captured. And you see it represented in the audio and also with subtitles, John's words and Paul's words. And that's incredible. Wow, how interesting that is, Basically, John says that, among other things, lately Paul is telling George and John what to play. But, John says, I don't tell you what to play. That kind of thing. And Paul concedes, and John agrees. Both of them concede that George is right. Lately we've been kind of like, I think John says not giving him any bandages. We're kind of like not being right to George. So they concede that they haven't been fair to George. And you get the impression from this bit of dialogue anyway, that that's the reason why George walked out pretty much. I mean, I heard all kinds of things I've been reading, and there's stories that George was having some affairs. And because of the affairs that he had, Patty Harrison, his wife, wanted to leave or break up, and whatever happened, I don't have it 100% in my mind at the moment when I need it. So there's a lot going on in George's personal life, and I think the way we were led to believe when you watch the Peter Jackson documentary is that it's George is kind of like feeling overshadowed by John and Paul and kicked over to the curb. And that's kind of what they're talking about here. It is an amazing conversation. And John says that they both have egos, John and Paul. And they do that to George, So basically, John is saying that he doesn't say it exactly, but he's implying that Paul is a control freak, too, lately. And Paul sort of goes along a little bit with that. He doesn't deny that, and then John says, it's like an effing job, he says, and he doesn't think the Beatles revolve around the four people anymore. Like just Paul, really. It's not four people anymore. Well, then after the meeting is over with John and Paul, they resume rejoin the others. Turns out George is in Liverpool, and he's not going to be back for a few days. So while they're still waiting for George to be back to Liverpool, from Liverpool, Paul, John, and Ringo work on Get Back, which is a fascinating version of Get Back as they continue to flesh out the song Get Back. And that's all on, I believe, January 13th, and that's just fascinating historical bit of stuff on that day. What a way to start. Okay, and then on January 14th, we have Paul playing a little bit of Martha, My Dear on piano, which had been on the White Album. Ringo joins Paul on the piano. That little bit of it is in the beginning of Let It Be, the Michael Lindsay Hogg movie, if you remember, where Ringo and Paul are sharing the piano and singing a song like "I Bought a Piano the Other Day." And there's a bit in here where Paul sings the song Woman, the woman song that he gave to Peter and Gordon. He does a little bit of that here. And then there is a little bit of Paul singing Backseat of My Car, which would ultimately appear on his Ram album. And I'm so glad that little snippet is in there. It's a beautiful moment. Now, there's a point in there where Peter Sellers, the actor, visits the studio because there are sets coming in for The Magic Christian. The Magic Christian is a film that's going to star Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr. And Ringo has to have the time to work on that film. So the schedule of the Beatles is also kind of tight because Ringo needs to get to working on the film. And Peter Sellers visits the studio, the actor, but it's really a rather awkward and unproductive meeting. Nothing really much happens. And, John in this meeting talks openly about getting stoned and getting high. And Paul asks, Lennon, is there any need to do this publicly? Paul, trying to keep it right, and Paul is getting frustrated, and you feel so sorry for Paul because his heart is in it. Nobody else's heart is in this, and he's saying we need to work. We need to have something, not just sit here and waste our time. We have to have a strict schedule that we schedule, I guess as Paul would say it, instead of just, doing nothing, and he's right. I'm so glad that when they're still in Twickenham, before they leave Twickenham, they have John doing the Mean Mr. Mustard bit. He does a little bit of Mean Mr. Mustard, a song that he hadn't finished yet, and also goes into Madman. And we'll hear more of Madman later when they move to another studio. So pretty much they pack up, everything from Twickenham. Great idea. So great to get out of there. The idea of a TV special is abandoned completely, and the Beatles moved to Apple at Savile Row in London, and they set up a basement studio. It's not really complete with the recording equipment, everything they need, because Magic Alex isn't really on the ball, and whatever he delivers is not very satisfactory. The sound is not up to par. So Glyn Johns is going to work on it and try to get a good recording studio, a functional recording studio going. There's a bit in there where two girls known as Apple Scruffs, George referred to them as, are outside the studios waiting for the Beatles. They just want to get a glimpse of the Beatles going into Apple. And they're interviewed for a little while saying how much they really hope that the Beatles get back to live performing and do a show of some kind. All right. Then what we start picking up the action in the Apple studio in the basement. And boy, as we know, as anybody who follows this stuff, the mood lifts 5,000%. It's a totally different atmosphere. It's a totally different Beatles. The Beatles are firing 100% on all cylinders. George Harrison returns and comes back, and it's like nothing ever happened. There's a bit in there about a newspaper article that alleges that John and Paul actually came to fisticuffs. All the rumors that started in the press and still go on today. And John and Paul are not too happy about hearing this. Nothing like that happened. They didn't fight each other. They didn't punch each other or anything. So it's a lot of nonsense. And we start to get to see John, which I love. In the first part, John is completely out there, maybe a little stoned, or very stoned sometimes, a little stoned other times, not stoned other times. But here, when you get to Apple, John is 100% John. He is focused completely, and he's even taking the lead in a lot of areas and being a little more dominant and a little more, controlling a little bit here and there, and being the John Lennon that he should really be, which I really love. And they start working on Dig a Pony. It also seems that John's got some songs now where he wasn't really coming up with anything in Twickenham and prior to this. So you got him doing a little bit of Madman. You got him doing a little bit of, a lot of Dig a Pony, and they're working on Dig a Pony. And John does Polythene Pam, among other things, and Can You Dig It? Not the full Dig It, but a shorter version called Can You Dig It? The long version of Dig It, a long version, is going to appear in this, but I don't think that's going to be till part 3. because that segment is not in this one. But Billy Preston arrives, according to what it says in the notes. He arrives at the studio, where they've known him since the Hamburg days, and they're friendly with Billy Preston. And he doesn't realize that the Beatles need a keyboard player, so the timing is perfect. And he plays electric piano. And they do I've Got a Feeling with Billy. They do a wonderful golden moment of version of Don't Let Me Down. That's one of my favorite bits in the entire thing. Billy, so excellent on those keyboards, electric piano, and doing a terrific version of Don't Let Me Down. Then we move on to January 23rd. And on January 23rd, there's another Yoko jam. And I'm glad that I have a moment to mention that, because somehow with all my notes, even, I forgot to mention in part one, there's a Yoko jam in part one. Now, these jams are not very long. And Yoko doesn't really sing. She does a lot of, her noises and caterwauling, or whatever you want to call it. But to me, what's interesting is the backing. The fact that you have Paul McCartney on drums, playing the drums, and here, and last time we had Ringo on drums. In the first part, with the first Yoko jam at Twickenham, in part one, you had Ringo smashing drums furiously, and very avant-garde, as avant-garde as Ringo could get. And here, you have Paul now doing some drums to Yoko, and they're trying to get feedback. I love that too. What I love about the Yoko jam is that it shows you that Paul and Ringo are perfectly game in trying to participate and try to get freaky with the Yoko stuff. I love that they're coming together, despite what they may be feeling about Yoko's intrusion or whatever their thoughts are. Nevertheless, they're all for it. The Beatles here are really doing great. Now, there is a wonderful moment that I was hoping would be in this film intact. We know at the beginning of these chapters, part one and part two, it tells you that there's going to be parental guidance advised, because you're going to have some swearing in here, and smoking. Smoking is also said to be, something you have to watch out for. But there's a version of Get Back, and it's a scene that a lot of you know what I'm going to talk about. I was hoping this would be in there. This little bit was featured in a montage last year that Peter Jackson offered us of a lot of segments from Get Back. And in this segment, it was edited. I said, I guess because it's Disney, they're not going to put it. Well, it's in there. It's a funny bit of business that I'm so glad is in there. And of course, I'm going to say bleep. It's an F-bomb, but I'm going to say bleep. Keep this family friendly, right? So anyway, John and Paul are standing upright. They're starting to play Get Back. They're getting into it. And Glyn Johns from the control room says something into the mic and stops them, interrupts them. And, they're like, hey, son. McCartney goes, don't interrupt. And John Lennon goes, hey, we're bloody stars, kidding around. And also jokingly, the bit that is intact is Paul says, hey, look, bleep face, with the F-bomb, F-face. And I love it. I love that bit is in there, that it's not cut. I was so thinking that little bit of humor was going to be cut out. It's great. He goes, don't interrupt, and it's all in fun. It's all playing in the context when you watch it. They're not angry, Yeah, I love that during this whole thing, John is really stepping up, offering parts of songs, ideas for songs, and he's very focused and involved. I love that. We get versions of Maggie May, Her Majesty, Teddy Boy, the little bit where John jokes around, kind of in the background, kind of ruining the song in a way. They got that little bit there that everybody likes from the old bootlegs. And they're working on Let It Be, trying to get Let It Be to really come into its own, which is wonderful. And George does a fantastic version of the song For You Blue, which is the one that wound up appearing on the actual Let It Be album. What's interesting as you get towards the end of part two is that, and this is weird because after Paul, all through part one, being, and early into part two, being the one that says we gotta do it to an audience again, we gotta get out, we gotta do this, we gotta do that. Now Paul seems a little bit afraid or hesitant to want to perform, which is weird. You would think that Paul was always the one that wants to perform the most, right? Well, it's John in part two that becomes the aggressor, the dominant force, and says, really expresses that he's very keen to do a live show. He wants to go on stage. He wants to do something live, and he thinks we should. It's amazing. It's just amazing. And now Paul is like, well, he's a little shy about it. He got a little stage fright or something, and that's weird that it shifted from Paul being the one that wanted to do it. Now John's the one who wants to do it. And finally, near the end of part two, there's a suggestion. Maybe we can go on the rooftop and do a show on top of the roof. And they actually show you footage of them going up to the roof, Paul and the director and some other people, or I think Ringo, I forget who else. They go up there and they try to see how secure the rooftop is. There's footage of them like, let's see if we can do this. And that's pretty much part two. And I'm telling you, from beginning to end, it's a joy. I didn't want this to stop. I'll be honest with you. Like I said, as a Beatles historian, if you will, a Beatles fanatic, I loved watching part one. But part one, there were times when I was like, this is getting a little bit monotonous, and can we move on? I almost didn't care if it ended, but that's okay, because that's the whole idea. I think when it comes to the whole thing that was Let It Be, to get back these sessions, January 69, I love that it's not a whitewash. It doesn't change history in any way. It is true. When John Lennon and the Rolling Stones said how miserable Let It Be was, when George Harrison called it Winter of Discontent, and he didn't like all the Let It Be stuff, they're really remembering mostly Twickenham, I think. Most of it is Twickenham, and that leaves a sour taste. It's a horrible environment and stuff, so I get that. Anyway, I could go on and on with this. I think I've covered it all, though, pretty much. I can't recommend part two enough. So if you're watching part one, you think, man, where's this going to go? Part two is perfect. I mean, the only I can't even see how part three is going to surpass part two. But because we have the rooftop concert, the whole thing is going to be the whole 42-minute rooftop concert as part of part three to look forward to. I think it's going to surpass part two if that's possible. Thank you, everybody. Talk to you again soon.